Now, I want to go over some of the findings at the cellular level. Um, and these are largely from autopsy studies. So um, I'll kind of unpack these one by one. So dying by suicide is associated with increased serotonergic cells. So the cells related to the serotonin system are, there's a greater number of them, and they seem to have a greater presence within the brain. Um, a second one is the increased tryptophan hydroxylase 2 protein per neuron. Tryptophan is a protein related to serotonin, and there you see a higher density of that protein in neurons. The third finding is that there's fewer mature granule neurons in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus, of course, is involved in memory. And when I thought about that, I thought, oh, when you have fewer mature neurons in the hippocampus, maybe that can have an impairment on one's memory. Well, that goes back to what we know about people who are at risk of suicide having a more general, in fact, an overgeneral memory, that they don't remember specifics, they remember generalities. And that's one of the things that we know is common among people who have uh, struggled with suicide. And so maybe that helps explain it. Fourth, that there's a finding that there's fewer noradrenergic cells in the locus coeruleus. Well, first off, I need to explain noradrenergic. You've probably, the adrenergic has to do with adrenaline. And you've probably heard of adrenaline. Noradrenergic has to do with the brain chemical, so the neurotransmitter, noradrenaline in the brain. Now, you might not recognize that name, and I just want to point out that the neurotransmitter that you probably have heard of, which is it's equal, which is the same thing, just a different name, is norepinephrine. So adrenaline is the noradrenergic is the way that the British have talked about it, and so that's the finding. But basically, what this is saying is that there's fewer norepinephrine cells in the locus coeruleus, and the locus coeruleus is significant because it's involved in stress and panic. It's part of the reticular activating system, sort of at the base of the brain. And it's, so again, when we think about suicidality, we kind of recognize that, stress and panic are part of the suicide response. And people who died by suicide have fewer of this particular type of cells in the locus coeruleus. Okay. Now, next is the loss of glia in the subgenual prefrontal cortex. I've got a picture of a neuron here, and you could see that the glia are not a part of a neuron. They're cells in itself, but they surround the neuron. So this neuron has a dendrites here, cell body here, and then a long axon. So the glia are what surround the axon and insulate it so that the signal could go from the cell body all the way to the end of the axon. And that there's fewer glia in the prefrontal cortex, the subgenual region of the prefrontal cortex. Finally, there's been the finding that there's cell atrophy in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and orbital frontal cortex. So both of these are regions in the prefrontal cortex, which of course we know is involved in executive control and planning and problem solving. And so it's interesting that we find that there's been atrophy of these cells in the prefrontal cortex. All right. Now, related to this is the finding about suicide and brain circuitry. I'll just go over a few of these. That activity in the anterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex has been connected to lethality of suicide attempt in people with major depression. And let me explain, all these findings are not on people who have died by suicide, but are instead fMRI studies. They found the anterior cingulate and medial prefrontal cortex was, the activity levels were connected to how lethal of a suicide attempt that they made. Second, changes in the activity level of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So it's kind of this region out here of the prefrontal cortex, and the inferior frontal gyrus were related to greater emotional pain in individuals with depression, and that emotional pain is associated with increased risk of suicide. And then abnormalities in the serotonin system seem to be a factor in lethal suicidal behavior. So one takeaway from this is I hope you understand that serotonin and the serotonin system are very much involved in suicidal behavior. The final finding I want to go over is that suicide attempters have different activation in the bilateral orbital frontal. So on both sides, the orbital frontal, which is right here above your eyes, and the right ventral medial, so sort of, well, it's on the right-hand side and toward the top and sort of towards the middle, and the anterior cingulate, and also the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So dorsal, I'm trying to remember all these are. So dorsolateral is, again, kind of right around here. And the suicide attempters have different activation in all of those things. Now, I don't want you to get lost in the details as psychology students, but what I do hope is that you appreciate that suicide, there's a lot going on in the brain that's different than people who aren't thinking about suicide or haven't attempted suicide. And so that's the key takeaway I want you to have for this. Now, going on to suicide and genetics, there's been a finding that approximately 50% of the risk of suicide is heritable. Now, just in case you aren't familiar with this idea of heritability, I really want to make this clear that that figure does not mean that a child of someone who died by suicide has a 50% risk of dying by suicide. That's not even close to the percentage. It's far, far less than that. What it means is that of those who died by suicide, 50% of the explanation for this can be traced back to genetic factors on average. So for those who, for some people, it could be far less than 50%, and then others, it might be quite a bit higher than 50%. But on average, they could say it's related to genetics. About 50% of it is related to genetics. And so that's an important thing to know, that it's highly genetic, but also it is by no means something that is determined at birth, that a person is never, you know, the fear for some people is that maybe they think that they're trapped in a cycle within the family, that they're doomed. And I just want to make sure that's not the case. That's not at all true. One thing along with this is that there are no single genes that have been identified as increasing risk of suicide. So we know that genetics are involved, but we cannot identify a single gene that's involved.